The sun barely crept over the jagged peaks of the Colorado Rockies when Eleanor Whitfield began her daily routine. At 32, she moved through the narrow boarding house room with practiced efficiency, avoiding the creaky floorboard near the window and the loose nail that caught her skirts by the door. The mirror above the washstand reflected what the townspeople of Cedar Ridge saw: a woman whose ample figure defied the corseted ideals of 1873, whose plain brown hair refused to hold the fashionable curls, whose hands bore the calluses of honest work rather than the softness of leisure. She dressed quickly in her serviceable gray wool dress, the one that didn't show the flour dust from McKenna's general store where she worked 6 days a week. The fabric stretched tight across her middle, a constant reminder of her failure to conform to the willowy silhouettes that graced the pages of Godey's Lady's Book. Eleanor had long since given up trying to squeeze into the stays that other women wore, accepting instead the pitying looks and whispered comments that followed her like shadows through the dusty streets. The boarding house was already stirring as she descended the narrow stairs. Mrs. Hartley, the proprietress, barely glanced up from her ledger as Eleanor passed. Their arrangement was simple reduced rent in exchange for Eleanor's help with the heavy washing on Sundays. It was charity disguised as commerce, and both women knew it. "Morning, Miss Whitfield," called Samuel, the telegraph operator's son. As Eleanor stepped onto Main Street, the boy was kind enough, but she caught the way his mother quickly ushered him along, as if Eleanor's unmarried state might be contagious. Cedar Ridge was coming alive in the crisp mountain air. Shopkeepers swept their doorsteps, sending small clouds of dust into the street. The smell of fresh bread wafted from Hanson's bakery, mingling with the sharp scent of pine lumber from the sawmill at the edge of town. Eleanor kept her eyes forward, her sturdy boots clicking against the wooden sidewalks with determined rhythm. At McKenna's general store, she fumbled with the heavy key ring, her fingers already stiff from the morning cold. The familiar smell of coffee beans, leather goods, and lamp oil greeted her as she pushed open the door. This was her domain, her refuge. Here, among the bolts of calico and sacks of flour, she could be useful, needed, if not wanted. "Eleanor, you're early again." Tom McKenna emerged from the back room, his arms full of inventory ledgers. He was a decent man, fair in his dealings and respectful in his manner. His wife, however, made her opinions known through tight-lipped smiles and frequent suggestions that Eleanor might be happier in a larger city with more opportunities. "The morning freight from Denver is due," Eleanor replied, already reaching for her apron. "I thought I'd get the storeroom ready." Tom nodded absently, already absorbed in his figures. Eleanor moved through the store, lighting the oil lamps against the dim morning light, arranging the displays of tinned goods and fabric notions. Her hands knew this work, found comfort in the routine of it. The bell above the door chimed throughout the morning as customers came and went. Eleanor served them all with quiet efficiency, the ranch wives buying supplies for the month, the miners stocking up before heading back to their claims, the proper ladies of the town who looked through her as if she were another fixture of the store. 20 pounds of flour, 10 of sugar, and that'll be 5 pounds of coffee. "Mrs. Garrett listed. Her voice clipped. She was the banker's wife, her burgundy silk dress immaculate despite the dust that plagued everything in Cedar Ridge. Eleanor measured and wrapped each item carefully, her movements precise. She'd learned long ago that perfection in service might somehow compensate for her imperfections in appearance. "Will Mr. Garrett be wanting his usual tobacco?" Eleanor asked politely. "Mrs. Garrett's lips pursed. "Yes, though I do hope Tom will consider hiring additional help soon. The store is so busy these days." The implication hung in the air. Surely a more presentable shop girl would be better for business. Eleanor merely nodded, adding the tobacco to the order. As Mrs. Garrett left, her skirts swishing importantly, Eleanor caught sight of herself in the glass of the counter display. The distortion made her appear even rounder, a caricature of femininity gone wrong. The lunch hour brought a brief respite. Eleanor sat in the back room with her simple meal bread, cheese, and an apple from the barrel out front. Tom had told her to help herself to what she needed, another small kindness that reminded her of her position. Not quite charity, but not quite earned either. She pulled out the small notebook she kept in her apron pocket, the one luxury she allowed herself. The pages were filled with her careful script observations about the weather, the comings and goings of the town, pressed flowers from her Sunday walks in the foothills. It wasn't a proper diary, not like the leather-bound journals the well-to-do ladies carried, but it was hers. Today she wrote, "Mrs. Garrett suggests I am not suitable for public view. Perhaps she is right. Nature did not craft me for display, but for endurance, like the stubby pines that grow twisted on the mountainside, surviving, but never beautiful." The afternoon brought the usual flow of customers. Eleanor helped old Mr. Chen select fabric for his daughter's wedding dress, her fingers gentle on the delicate silk. She assisted the widow Patterson in calculating her monthly credit, discreetly adjusting the figures to ensure the proud woman could afford her necessities. These small acts of kindness were invisible to most, but they gave Eleanor purpose. As the sun began its descent behind the mountains, painting the sky in shades of amber and rose, the store grew quiet. Eleanor was arranging a new shipment of boots when she heard the conversation at the front counter. "Saw him coming down from the high country yesterday, that wild man. What's his name? Hayes Hawkins?" "Hawthorne." Tom supplied, "Ezra Hawthorne. He's no wild man, just keeps to himself." Same difference. The customer, one of the ranch hands from the Patterson spread, laughed. "Man lives alone up in those mountains for years, only coming to town twice a year that ain't natural." Eleanor knew of Ezra Hawthorne, though she'd never seen him. He was part of Cedar Ridge's mythology, the mountain man who'd abandoned civilization after some unnamed tragedy, who could track a deer through a blizzard and survive winters that would kill most men. The stories painted him as part hermit, part savage, a cautionary tale about what happened when men turned their backs on society. "He's due for supplies," Tom said evenly. "Always pays in gold nuggets or pelts. Better customer than most." The ranch hand snorted but said no more, completing his purchase and leaving as the shadows grew long outside. Eleanor finished with the boots, her mind lingering on the conversation. What would drive a man to choose such isolation? Was the company of others truly such a burden that the harsh solitude of the mountains was preferable? As she prepared to close the store, Eleanor felt the familiar weight of evening settling on her shoulders. Another day done, another night ahead in her small room. She would heat a simple supper on the boarding house's communal stove, endure the polite distance of the other boarders, and retire to her room where the silence was both comfort and condemnation. The walk back to the boarding house took her past the Methodist church where the Ladies' Aid Society was gathering. Through the lit windows, she could see the married women of the town, their heads bent together over their sewing, their laughter carrying on the cool evening air. Eleanor had attended once, years ago, but the weight of their suggestions about her diet, her appearance, her prospects had driven her away. Better to be alone than to be a project. As she climbed the stairs to her room that night, Eleanor caught herself thinking again of the mountain man, Ezra Hawthorne, who chose the harsh embrace of winter peaks over the suffocating kindness of society. Perhaps he understood something she was only beginning to grasp, that there were different kinds of cold, and not all of them came from the weather. She prepared for bed methodically, brushing out her hair that never held a curl, washing her face that would never launch ships. In the cracked mirror, she saw what she always saw, Eleanor Whitfield, spinster, shop girl, burden. Tomorrow would bring more of the same, an endless cycle of days blending into one another like the weathered boards of Cedar Ridge's buildings. But as she blew out her candle and settled into the narrow bed, Eleanor found herself wondering what the mountains looked like at night from way up high, where only the stars kept company and the opinion of society couldn't reach. It was a foolish thought. impractical and romantic in a way she couldn't afford to be. Still, as sleep claimed her, she held onto it like a secret, pressed between the pages of her ordinary life like the wildflowers in her notebook, small, overlooked, but somehow still blooming. The morning arrived with an unseasonable chill that made Eleanor's joints protest as she dressed. October in the Rockies was unpredictable, but this cold snap promised an early winter. She wrapped her heavy shawl tighter as she made her way to the store, her breath forming small clouds in the crisp air. Tom was already there when she arrived, standing on the front porch with his arms crossed, watching something down the street. "Morning, Eleanor. We've got company coming." She followed his gaze and saw what had captured his attention. A man was walking up Main Street, leading a pack mule laden with furs. But it wasn't the mule or its cargo that made people stop and stare. It was the man himself. Ezra Hawthorne moved like the mountains had carved him from their own stone, tall and broad-shouldered. He wore buckskins that had seen seasons of weather, and his dark hair hung past his collar, streaked with premature silver. A full beard covered the lower half of his face, but it couldn't hide the sharp angles of his cheekbones or the weathered lines around his eyes. He walked with the easy grace of someone who knew every root and rock of the wilderness, his rifle carried casually over one shoulder. "That's him," Tom said unnecessarily. "Better open up. He'll want to get his business done quick." Eleanor hurried inside, her hands fumbling with her apron strings. She'd seen rough men before: miners, trappers, cowboys, but something about this man's approach made her nervous. Perhaps it was the stories, or perhaps it was the way the townspeople gave him a wide berth, as if wildness might be contagious. The bell chimed as he entered, and Eleanor busied herself behind the counter, arranging items that didn't need arranging. She heard Tom greet him, heard the low rumble of Hawthorne's response, but didn't look up until Tom called her over. "Eleanor, Mr. Hawthorne has a list. Would you help gather his supplies while I evaluate his pelts?" She had no choice but to turn and face him. Up close, Ezra Hawthorne was even more imposing. He stood well over 6 feet, his presence filling the store in a way that had nothing to do with his physical size. But it was his eyes that caught her, gray as winter storms. They held a depth of solitude that made her chest tighten with unexpected recognition. "Ma'am," he said, his voice rough from disuse. He handed her a piece of paper, his handwriting surprisingly neat for someone who lived beyond civilization's reach. Eleanor took the list, careful not to let their fingers touch. "I'll gather these right away, Mr. Hawthorne." She expected him to join Tom at the back counter where the pelts were being examined. But instead, he remained where he was, his storm-gray eyes following her movements. Eleanor tried to ignore him, focusing on the list: flour, coffee, salt, ammunition, lamp oil, the basics of survival. But also unexpected items: tea, good soap, a new whetstone, writing paper. "The paper's on the top shelf," she said, more to fill the silence than anything. "We just got a shipment from Denver. I can reach it." Before she could protest, he was beside her, his arm stretching easily to the high shelf. He smelled of pine smoke and leather, of snow and something indefinably wild. Eleanor stepped back quickly, clutching the other items to her chest. "No need to be skittish," he said, and she could have sworn there was amusement in his voice. "I've been told I'm house-trained." Heat flooded her cheeks. "I didn't mean that. I wasn't—" "You're Eleanor Whitfield." It wasn't a question. She blinked, surprised. "Yes, how did you—" "Tom speaks well of you. Says you're the most reliable person in Cedar Ridge." He studied her with those penetrating eyes. "Also says you know your letters and numbers better than most." Eleanor didn't know how to respond to that. Compliments were rare enough, but coming from this man who supposedly shunned all human contact, it was doubly unexpected. I do my best, Mr. Hawthorne." "Ezra," he corrected. "Mr. Hawthorne was my father, and he's been dead these 15 years. She nodded, Returning to gathering his supplies, he didn't move away, instead watching as she carefully measured coffee beans into a cloth sack. His presence should have been oppressive, but strangely, it wasn't. There was a stillness to him, like a mountain pool deep and calm on the surface, with unknowable depths below. "You don't flinch," he observed suddenly. Eleanor looked up, confused. "I beg your pardon." "Most folks in town, they flinch when I come near, like I might bite." His mouth quirked in what might have been a smile beneath his beard. "You don't." "Should I?" The question slipped out before she could stop it, and she immediately wished she could take it back. This time, he definitely smiled, a flash of white teeth that transformed his face. "No, ma'am, I save my biting for things that deserve it." Tom returned then, a pouch of gold nuggets in his hand. "Good quality furs, as always. This should more than cover your supplies, with credit left over." Ezra nodded, but didn't take his eyes off Eleanor. "I'll need these things packed for mule transport. And..." He paused, seeming to consider something. "Add a pound of those maple sugar candies." Eleanor's hands stilled. The maple candies were expensive. Imported from Vermont. "Of course. Would you like them wrapped separately?" "Yes." She packaged his supplies efficiently, wrapping everything in oilcloth to protect against the weather. All the while, she felt his gaze on her. Not inappropriate, but intensely observant, as if he were reading trail signs in her movements. When everything was ready, Tom helped him load the pack mule outside. Eleanor thought that would be the end of it. But Ezra returned, carrying something in his hands. "For your help," he said, placing a small wooden box on the counter. Eleanor stared at it, confused. "Mr. Hawthorne Ezra, I can't accept payment. Mr. McKenna pays my wages." "It's not payment." He pushed the box closer to her. "It's appreciation. There's a difference." With hands that trembled slightly, Eleanor opened the box. Inside, nestled on a bed of dried moss, was a piece of honeycomb, golden and perfect, still faintly fragrant with wildflower honey. "From a hive up near Shepherd's Peak," he said. "Bees work hard up there, making something sweet in a harsh place." He paused, and his gray eyes met hers with unexpected intensity. "Figured someone else who does the same might appreciate it." Before Eleanor could form a response, he was gone, the bell chiming his departure. She stood frozen, the box of honeycomb in her hands, as Tom came back inside. "Well, that was unusual," Tom said, shaking his head. "In 5 years of trading with him, I've never seen him say more than 10 words at a time. You must have made an impression." Eleanor carefully closed the box, her mind whirling. He was just being polite. Tom snorted. "Eleanor, that man hasn't been polite since his wife died. He's been cordial, fair, honest, but not polite. There's a difference." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Eleanor served customers, balanced ledgers, swept floors, but her mind kept returning to gray eyes and honeycomb, to a voice like distant thunder and hands that could have crushed the delicate gift but had handled it with infinite care. That evening, the boarding house was abuzz with gossip. News traveled fast in Cedar Ridge, and Ezra Hawthorne's extended visit to the general store was apparently noteworthy enough to set tongues wagging. "Stayed nearly an hour. Mrs." Hartley announced over dinner, as if sharing news of a scandal. "Mrs. Peterson saw the whole thing from the millinery shop." "I heard he actually spoke to the Whitfield woman," added Miss Crawford, the schoolteacher, with a delicate shudder. "Can you imagine that wild man?" Eleanor kept her eyes on her plate, cutting her chicken into smaller and smaller pieces. "Now, ladies, Mr. Donnelly," the retired postal clerk, interjected mildly. "Ezra Hawthorne's no wild man. He's educated. Used to be an engineer with the railroad before he took to the mountains." "That doesn't make him civilized." "Mrs." Hartley countered. A man who chooses to live like a savage, away from Christian society, and now he's sniffing around our Eleanor. Our Eleanor, as if she were a pet or a piece of communal property to be protected. He was purchasing supplies, Eleanor said quietly. Her first contribution to the conversation, nothing more. Miss Crawford tittered. "Oh, Eleanor, you're so innocent. Men like that, they have appetites. Living alone all those years, he's probably looking for a woman to warm his bed, and you'd do well to stay clear." The crude insinuation made Eleanor's cheeks burn, but it was Mr. Donnelly who spoke up again. "That's enough of that talk. The man lost his wife and baby daughter to scarlet fever. Maybe he just prefers the honest loneliness of the mountains to the cruel gossip of towns." The table fell silent at that, and Eleanor escaped to her room as soon as she could. She sat on her bed, the box of honeycomb in her lap, and thought about what Mr. Donnelly had said, a wife and daughter, lost to illness. It explained the sadness she'd seen in those gray eyes, the way he moved through town like a ghost visiting his former life. She opened the box and broke off a small piece of honeycomb, letting the honey melt on her tongue. It tasted of summer and sunshine, of wildflowers she'd never see because they bloomed too high for her to climb. It tasted of sweetness earned through patient work in a harsh place. In her notebook that night she wrote, "A man came down from the mountains today. The others see wildness, but I saw grief worn smooth like river stones. He gave me honey from heights I'll never reach, and spoke of harsh places that bloom. I think perhaps the cold he carries isn't from the winter peaks, but from the frozen moment when his world stopped. How strange that his kindness should warm me when the whole town's sympathy leaves me cold." As she prepared for bed, Eleanor found herself wondering if he would return before spring, or if this brief encounter would fade into Cedar Ridge's mythology like all his other visits. She touched the box of honeycomb, still fragrant with mountain flowers, and felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, but a crack in the resignation she'd wrapped around herself like armor. Outside her window, the first snow of the season began to fall, dusting the town in white, somewhere in those mountains. A man who understood harsh places was probably watching the same snow, perhaps thinking of the woman who hadn't flinched. Or perhaps not. Eleanor had learned not to trust in perhaps. But still, as she drifted towards sleep, she found herself saving the taste of wild honey on her tongue, a secret sweetness in the harsh place of her life. The weeks following Ezra's visit passed with agonizing normalcy. November brought serious snow, blanketing Cedar Ridge in white and making the mountain passes treacherous. Eleanor went about her routines, opening the store, serving customers, enduring the boarding house dinners, but something had changed. She found herself glancing up whenever the bell chimed, her heart performing a peculiar skip before settling back into disappointment. The honeycomb sat in her room, carefully rationed. Each evening, she allowed herself the smallest taste, letting the sweetness linger as she wrote in her notebook. The other boarders had stopped talking about Ezra Hawthorne's visit, moving on to fresher gossip. But Eleanor couldn't forget the weight of his gaze or the careful way he'd handled that delicate gift. Then, on a Thursday afternoon when the sky hung heavy with the promise of another storm, he returned. Eleanor was on her knees, arranging bolts of fabric that had arrived on the morning freight, when she heard the bell. She looked up to find him standing in the doorway, snow dusting his shoulders, those gray eyes finding her immediately. "Miss Whitfield." He removed his hat, shaking the snow from it. "Tom around?" "He's at the bank," she managed, getting to her feet and smoothing her skirts. "He should return within the hour." Ezra nodded, but instead of leaving to return later, he moved into the store. "I can wait." She noticed he carried something, a cloth bundle tucked under one arm. "Can I get you some coffee while you wait? There's a fresh pot on the stove." "That would be appreciated." Eleanor poured the coffee with hands that remained admirably steady, adding a splash of cream the way she'd seen him take it last time. He accepted the cup with a nod of thanks, wrapping his large hands around it. "Early storm coming," he said, gazing out the window. Could see it building from up high. Town might be cut off for a few days. We're prepared for it, Eleanor replied. Tom always stocks extra before winter. Smart man. Ezra took a sip of coffee, then set the cup on the counter. Speaking of prepared, I brought something. He unwrapped the bundle, revealing a pair of rabbit skin mittens lined with soft fur. The craftsmanship was exceptional, the stitching small and even, the leather supple and well-worked. For me, Eleanor couldn't hide her surprise. Noticed last time your hands were chapped from the cold. These'll help. He pushed them toward her. Made them myself. The linings from rabbits that only live above the tree line. Warmest fur you can find. Eleanor touched the mittens reverently. They were beautiful, practical, and represented hours of careful work. I don't know what to say. Say you'll wear them? No point in warm mittens sitting in a drawer. She slipped them on, marveling at how perfectly they fit. The fur lining was impossibly soft, immediately warming her perpetually cold hands. They're wonderful. Something shifted in his expression, a softening around his eyes. They suit you. The bell chimed again, and Mrs. Garrett swept in with her daughter Constance, a pretty girl of 18 who was being carefully groomed for an advantageous marriage. Both women stopped short at the sight of Ezra. Mr. Hawthorne. Mrs., Garrett said coolly, drawing Constance closer as if wildness might be catching. Her eyes narrowed as she noticed Eleanor wearing the mittens. How unexpected to see you in town again so soon. Ezra inclined his head politely but said nothing. The silence stretched uncomfortably until Mrs. Garrett cleared her throat. We need ribbon. Eleanor, the blue silk, 3 yards. Eleanor reluctantly removed the mittens, setting them carefully aside before measuring the ribbon. She could feel Mrs. Garrett's disapproval radiating like heat from a stove. Such unusual mittens, Constance said innocently, though her eyes held her mother's calculating look. Where did you purchase them? Miss Whitfield? They were a gift, Eleanor replied quietly, wrapping the ribbon in brown paper. A gift, Mrs. Garrett's voice rose. How inappropriate, Eleanor. Surely you know better than to accept personal items from men. What will people think? They'll think she has warm hands, Ezra said mildly. But there was steel beneath the words. Mrs. Garrett's face flushed. Mr. Hawthorne, you may live outside the bounds of propriety, but those of us in town maintain certain standards. An unmarried woman accepting gifts from a man, particularly a man of your situation, well, it simply isn't done. Mother, Constance whispered, tugging at her arm, clearly uncomfortable with the confrontation. But Mrs. Garrett wasn't finished. Eleanor, I feel it's my Christian duty to warn you. Men who live as Mr. Hawthorne does, away from civilized company, they develop certain expectations. You're a good woman. If naive, don't let loneliness drive you to impropriety. Eleanor's cheeks burned with humiliation. She focused on tying the ribbon package, willing her hands not to shake. Ma'am, Ezra's voice was dangerously quiet. I'd ask you to consider your words carefully. Miss Whitfield has shown me nothing but professional courtesy, and I've offered nothing but respect in return. The impropriety here isn't in a gift of mittens to keep working hands warm. It's in the assumptions being made by those who claim higher standards. Mrs. Garrett drew herself up, preparing another volley, but Constance pulled her toward the door. Mother, please, we'll be late for the ladies' aid meeting. After they left, the store felt too quiet. Eleanor couldn't bring herself to look at Ezra, mortification sitting like a stone in her stomach. I should go, she said. Those were a kind gift, but Mrs. Garrett is right. I shouldn't accept them. People will talk. People already talk. His voice was gentle now. Does their opinion matter so much? It has to, Eleanor said, finally meeting his eyes. "You don't understand. You chose to leave society behind. I'm still here, still trying to belong somewhere. If my reputation—" She stopped, unable to voice the truth that her reputation was one of the few things protecting her from complete invisibility. Ezra studied her for a long moment. Then he picked up the mittens and placed them in her hands, closing her fingers around them. "A gift freely given carries no obligations. Miss Whitfield, wear them or don't, but don't refuse them because of what others might whisper. In my experience, they'll whisper regardless." Tom returned then, breaking the moment. Ezra conducted his business trading gold for winter supplies and ammunition with his usual efficiency. But before he left, he paused at the door. "The storm will hit by nightfall," he told Eleanor. "Make sure you get home safe." Then he was gone, leaving Eleanor clutching the mittens and wondering why his simple concern made her chest ache. True to his prediction, the storm arrived with a vengeance. Eleanor barely made it to the boarding house before the wind picked up, driving snow horizontal through the streets. By morning, Cedar Ridge was buried under 3 feet of fresh powder, with drifts reaching first-floor windows. For 3 days, the town remained cut off, the boarding house residents huddled together, sharing meals from their dwindling supplies and keeping the fires constantly fed. Eleanor wore the rabbit-skin mittens constantly, ignoring the pointed looks from Mrs. Hartley and Miss Crawford. On the 3rd night, as the storm finally began to exhaust itself, Mr. Donnelly sat beside Eleanor in the common room. "Fine mittens," he observed. "Rabbit fur lining, if I'm not mistaken." Eleanor nodded, not trusting herself to speak. "You know," the old man continued, staring into the fire, "I knew Ezra Hawthorne before, when he was a railroad engineer. Brilliant man. Could calculate loads and stresses in his head, design bridges that would stand for centuries." "What happened?" Eleanor asked softly. "Life happened. He met Margaret at a church social in Denver. Tiny little thing, full of laughter. They married within 6 months, moved to a little house outside town. When their daughter came along, I'd never seen a man so happy. Used to carry that baby everywhere, showing her off like she was the greatest engineering feat he'd ever accomplished." Mr. Donnelly paused, his eyes distant with memory. "When the fever took them, something broke in him. Not just his heart, his faith in the order of things. An engineer understands cause and effect, stress and support. But there's no calculating grief, no blueprint for loss. So he went to the only place that made sense anymore, the mountains, where survival follows rules he could understand." "Why are you telling me this?" Eleanor asked. The old man smiled gently. "Because I see how you look when his name is mentioned, and because I think you should know those mittens aren't just a gift. For a man like Ezra to make something with his own hands, to come down from his mountain twice in a month, well, that means something." Before Eleanor could respond, he patted her shoulder and shuffled off to bed, leaving her alone with the dying fire and thoughts that chased themselves in circles. She pulled out her notebook, but for once, words failed her. How could she capture the complexity of what she felt fear and hope warred in her chest, along with something else, a dangerous warmth that had nothing to do with rabbit fur mittens? Outside, the storm was breaking. Through the frost-etched window, Eleanor could see stars emerging between the fleeing clouds. Somewhere up in those mountains, a man who understood blueprints but not grief was probably watching the same stars. She thought of Mrs. Garrett's warnings, of the whispers that would follow if she continued down this path. Then she thought of gray eyes that saw her, truly saw her, and hands that could craft beauty from the simple need to keep her warm. The mittens were soft against her cheek as she held them close. Tomorrow would bring fresh gossip, new warnings, more reminders of her place in Cedar Ridge's social order. But tonight, in the aftermath of the storm, Eleanor allowed herself to imagine what it might be like to stop trying to belong in a place that had already decided she didn't fit. In her notebook, she finally wrote, "A storm has passed, leaving the world transformed. everything familiar buried under new snow, waiting to reveal what shape it will take come spring. I wear mittens made by hands that understand both engineering and solitude. Perhaps that is enough to be understood by one who chooses isolation over the falseness of belonging. Perhaps the warmth I feel has nothing to do with rabbit fur and everything to do with being seen as worthy of such careful work. As she prepared for bed, Eleanor made a decision. The next time Ezra Hawthorne came to town, and somehow she knew there would be a next time, she would not let others' opinions drive her actions. She had spent too long trying to shrink herself to fit their expectations, to no avail. The mittens lay on her nightstand, soft and warm and real. Whatever came next, she would face it with warm hands and something she hadn't felt in years, the fragile, dangerous bloom of hope. The gossip started before Eleanor even reached the store the next morning. Mrs. Peterson stood outside the millinery shop, ostensibly sweeping her steps but clearly lying in wait. "Eleanor, dear," she called out, her voice honeyed with false concern. "I do hope you're being careful. We all heard about Mr. Hawthorne's attentions." Eleanor pulled her shawl tighter. She'd left the rabbit-skin mittens in her room, a small act of cowardice she already regretted. "Good morning, Mrs. Peterson. It's just that we worry about you." The woman moved closer, her breath forming clouds in the cold air. "A woman in your position can't be too careful. Men like that, they might see you as, well, as someone who can't afford to be particular." The words stung precisely because Eleanor had thought them herself 100 times. She forced a pleasant expression. "Thank you for your concern. I really must open the store." But Mrs. Peterson wasn't finished. "You know, Mr. Garrett's cousin is visiting next month. A widower from Colorado Springs. Very respectable. Owns a dry goods business. Perhaps you should consider—" "The store, Mrs. Peterson," Eleanor interrupted, her patience fraying. "Tom depends on me." She escaped into McKenna's, but the damage was done. All morning, as she served customers, she felt their speculative glances, heard the whispers that stopped when she approached. Even Tom seemed uncomfortable, clearing his throat frequently and finding reasons to work in the back room. It was almost a relief when Reverend Wallace entered just before noon. The Methodist minister was a kind man, if somewhat bound by convention. Eleanor had always appreciated that he treated her with genuine respect, not the pitying condescension of his congregation. "Miss Whitfield," he greeted her warmly. "Might I have a word?" Eleanor's heart sank. "Of course, Reverend." He glanced around the empty store, then spoke quietly. "I've had some members of the congregation express concerns about your association with Mr. Hawthorne." "We have no association," Eleanor said stiffly. "He's a customer of the store." "I understand that. But Eleanor, may I call you Eleanor? You must understand how things appear. You're a good woman, but you're also vulnerable. Men who live outside society's bounds. They don't always understand or respect our conventions." Eleanor thought of Ezra's careful courtesy, the way he'd defended her to Mrs. Garrett. "With respect, Reverend Mr. Hawthorne has shown me nothing but proper behavior." "I'm glad to hear it. But Eleanor, you must think of your future. You're not getting younger, and opportunities—" He paused delicately. "Well, there's Mr. Garrett's cousin, a good man, looking for a woman to help raise his 3 children. It would be a respectable position. A respectable position. Not a wife, not a partner, but a position, like being a governess or housekeeper, but with the added duties of a marriage bed." Eleanor's stomach turned. "I appreciate your concern, Reverend," he sighed. "Just be careful. My dear, the path of righteousness isn't always the easy path, but it's the sure one." After he left, Eleanor stood behind the counter, her hands trembling slightly. She thought of the notebook hidden in her room, filled with pressed flowers and observations nobody would ever care to read. She thought of 32 years of being careful, of being righteous, of making herself smaller and quieter and less offensive to those around her. Where had it gotten her standing in a store that wasn't hers, being warned away from the first person in years who'd looked at her and seen something worth warming? The afternoon dragged on. Eleanor went through the motions helping customers, updating ledgers, cleaning shelves that were already clean. When the bell chimed near closing time, she didn't look up, weary of facing another concerned citizen. Miss Whitfield. Her head snapped up. Ezra stood in the doorway, and she could tell immediately that something was different. His jaw was set with determination, and he carried himself with the same purpose she'd seen when he defended her to Mrs. Garrett. "Mr. Hawthorne," she said formally, aware that Mrs. Peterson was probably watching from across the street. He approached the counter, his gray eyes never leaving her face. "I've been thinking." "Oh." "About what people say, about propriety and reputation." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I've spent 7 years caring nothing for others' opinions, but I realize now that's a luxury you can't afford." Eleanor's heart sank. He was going to stop coming to town, stop these visits that had become bright spots in her gray routine. "I understand." "No," he said firmly. "I don't think you do." He reached into his coat and pulled out an envelope. "This is a letter of introduction to Mrs. Chen. You know her, the old Chinese man's wife. She does laundry for the mining camps, but her hands aren't what they used to be. She needs help, and she pays fair wages, better than what Tom can afford." Eleanor stared at the envelope, confused. "I don't understand. If you worked for her, you'd be away from town more, up at the camps. And if someone happened to teach you how to identify edible plants along the way, or how to read weather signs, or how to navigate by stars, well, that would just be practical knowledge for a woman traveling those roads." Understanding dawned slowly. "You're suggesting—" "I'm suggesting nothing improper," Ezra said carefully. "Just that a woman who works the mountain roads might benefit from mountain knowledge. And if that knowledge happened to come from someone who knows those mountains well, people would still talk. Let them. But it would be harder to fault a working arrangement. Mrs. Chen is respected. She's been here longer than most of the townspeople. Her recommendation carries weight." Eleanor picked up the envelope with trembling fingers. "Why are you doing this?" For the first time since entering, Ezra seemed uncertain. He removed his hat, turning it in his hands. "Because I remember what it's like to be trapped by others' expectations. Because you looked at me that first day like I was just a man buying supplies, not a curiosity or a cautionary tale. Because—" He stopped, then continued more quietly. "Because I made those mittens while thinking of you working in the cold. And I find I can't stop thinking of ways to make your life warmer." The honesty of it took Eleanor's breath away. She pressed the envelope to her chest, feeling like she stood at the edge of a precipice. "Mrs. Chen," she said slowly. "Would she really hire me?" "She would. I spoke to her yesterday. She remembers you helping her husband with fabric, how you always took time to understand what he needed despite the language barrier. She says a woman who shows such patience would be welcome. And the mountain knowledge," a small smile touched his lips, "would be freely shared. No obligations, as I said before." Tom emerged from the back room then, stopping short when he saw Ezra. "Oh, Hawthorne. Didn't hear you come in." "I was just leaving," Ezra said, placing his hat back on his head. He nodded to Eleanor. "Think about it. Miss Whitfield, Mrs. Chen will wait for your answer." After he left, Tom approached Eleanor cautiously. "What did he want?" She showed him the letter. Tom read it, his eyebrows rising. "Mrs. Chen pays well, almost double what I can afford." "I wouldn't leave you without help," Eleanor said quickly. Tom waved that away. "My nephew's been wanting to learn the business, but Eleanor—" He hesitated. "You know what people will say. Working the camps, spending time on the mountain roads. And if Hawthorne is involved. I know. Eleanor folded the letter carefully. But Tom, what do I have to lose? My sterling reputation, my excellent marriage prospects. The bitterness in her voice surprised them both. Tom's expression softened. You're a good woman. Eleanor, you deserve better than what this town's given you. That evening, Eleanor sat in her room, the letter open before her and her notebook in her lap. The rabbit-skin mittens lay beside her, soft testimony to one man's consideration. She thought of Reverend Wallace's words about the sure path of righteousness. But what righteousness was there in living a half-life, always small, always apologizing for taking up space? What virtue in accepting a position as an unpaid housekeeper and nursemaid to a widower's children, just for the respectability of being called Mrs.? In her notebook, she wrote, I stand at a crossroads. One path leads to safety, a loveless marriage, a respectable position, a slow dimming of what little light I have left. The other leads to uncertainty, mountain roads and mining camps, useful work and new knowledge, the dangerous warmth of gray eyes that see me truly. They say the righteous path is narrow, but perhaps they're wrong. Perhaps it's the wide road of convention that leads to destruction of the soul, while the narrow mountain trail leads to life. She thought of Ezra's words. I can't stop thinking of ways to make your life warmer. When had anyone ever spent such thought on her comfort? When had anyone seen her as deserving of more than grudging charity or pitying kindness? Eleanor picked up the mittens, slipping them on. They were perfectly fitted to her hands, each stitch a small act of care. She thought of the hours he must have spent making them, alone in his mountain cabin, thinking of her cold hands as she worked. Tomorrow, the town would buzz with fresh gossip. Mrs. Garrett would be scandalized. Mrs. Peterson would cluck with disapproval, and Reverend Wallace would pray for her soul. But tonight, Eleanor made her choice. She would go to Mrs. Chen. She would learn the mountain roads, and if a certain mountain man happened to share his knowledge of surviving in harsh places, well, she was tired of barely surviving in the supposedly civilized world. Perhaps it was time to learn a different kind of strength. Outside her window, stars appeared between scudding clouds. Eleanor looked up at them, thinking of navigation lessons to come, of learning to find her way by celestial light instead of social convention. Her hands were warm in their rabbit fur lining, and her heart, for the first time in years, felt the dangerous stirring of possibility. Tomorrow would bring consequences, but tonight, Eleanor Whitfield chose the narrow path that led up and away from everything she'd known, toward something that might, just might, be called freedom. The morning Eleanor was to meet Ezra for her first mountain lesson dawned crystal clear and bitter cold. She'd been working for Mrs. Chen for 2 weeks now, making the trek to the mining camps 3 times weekly with loads of clean laundry. The work was hard but honest, and Mrs. Chen's quiet approval meant more than years of grudging tolerance in town. Eleanor waited at the designated spot, a lightning-struck pine just past the Turner Creek Bridge, well out of sight of Cedar Ridge's curious eyes. She wore her sturdiest boots and the divided skirt misses. Chen had helped her fashion for riding. The rabbit-skin mittens kept her hands warm as she shifted nervously from foot to foot. She heard him before she saw him, the soft crunch of snow under sure feet, the quiet nickering of horses. Ezra emerged from the tree line leading 2 mounts, his own rangy gelding and a smaller, stockier mare. "Morning," he said, his breath clouding in the frigid air. "Ready to learn." Eleanor eyed the mare uncertainly. "I should tell you I've never ridden anything but the delivery wagon. That's why we're starting with Buttercup here. She's got more patience than a saint and a gait smooth as cream." He handed Eleanor the reins. First lesson, how to read a horse. For the next hour, Ezra taught her the basics: how to approach a horse, how to read its body language, how to mount and dismount safely. His teaching style was patient and practical, never condescending. When Eleanor struggled with her skirts while mounting, he simply showed her a different technique without comment. "You're doing fine," he said as she finally settled into the saddle. Now, we ride slow. Feel how she moves. Don't fight it, move with her. They rode at a walk up the gradually climbing trail. Ezra pointed out landmarks, teaching her to navigate. See that outcrop looks like a bear's head from this angle. That's your marker for the split to Mason's camp. And those 3 pines growing from one root, that means you're 2 miles from water. Eleanor tried to memorize everything, acutely aware of him riding beside her. Away from town, Ezra seemed to expand, becoming more himself. He talked more freely, sharing knowledge accumulated over 7 years of mountain living. Winter's the honest season up here, he said, guiding them around a fallen log. No pretense, no hiding what things really are. You respect it or it kills you. Simple as that. Is that why you stayed? Eleanor asked, then immediately regretted the personal question. But Ezra didn't seem to mind. Partly. After Margaret and Lucy died, I couldn't stand the sympathetic looks, the well-meaning visits, everyone wanting to help, but really just wanting me to perform my grief in a way they could understand. He paused, looking out over the valley below. Up here, I could just be broken for a while, no one asking me to heal on their schedule. They reached a small clearing where he called a halt. Time for the next lesson. Fire in the snow. Eleanor dismounted more gracefully than she'd mounted, proud of the small accomplishment. She watched as Ezra showed her how to find dry wood even in winter, how to clear snow down to bare ground, how to build a fire that would burn hot with minimal smoke. Your turn, he said, scattering the kindling. Eleanor's first attempt failed. Her second produced smoke but no flame. On the third try, working with cold, stiffened fingers despite the mittens, she coaxed a small flame to life. Good, Ezra said simply, but his approval warmed her more than the fire. They sat on a fallen log, sharing the coffee he'd brought in a thermos and the cornbread Eleanor had tucked in her pack. The silence between them was comfortable, filled with the crackle of fire and the distant cry of a hawk. Can I ask you something? Eleanor said eventually. He nodded, watching the fire. Why teach me all this, really? Ezra was quiet for so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, because I remember what it's like to not fit where you're supposed to. When I was an engineer, I could never quite be what they wanted, ambitious enough, social enough, willing to play the games needed to advance. Margaret was the only one who didn't try to change me. He picked up a stick, poking at the fire. You have that same look sometimes, like you're apologizing for existing. Eleanor's throat tightened. I've never been what Cedar Ridge wanted me to be. Maybe that's not a failing on your part. Maybe Cedar Ridge has small ideas about what people should be. A wind picked up, sending snow devils dancing across the clearing. Ezra stood, offering her a hand up. Come on, more to show you before we lose the light. The rest of the day was a revelation. He taught her to read weather signs in the clouds and wind patterns, to identify animal tracks in the snow, to find her direction by the growth of moss on trees. Eleanor's notebook filled with sketches and observations. But it was the in-between moments that lodged in her heart, the way he steadied her when she slipped on ice, his hand warm and solid on her elbow, his quiet pride when she successfully identified a deer trail, the careful way he adjusted her hold on the reins, his fingers gentle over hers. As the sun began its descent toward the peaks, they turned back. Eleanor felt muscles she'd never used protesting, but there was an exhilaration too, a sense of capability she'd never experienced. You did well, Ezra said as they neared the lightning-struck pine. Natural instincts for the mountains. I had a good teacher. He dismounted first, then helped her down. For a moment, they stood close, his hands on her waist, her hands on his shoulders for balance. Eleanor could smell wood smoke and pine on him, could see flecks of gold in his gray eyes. Eleanor, he said softly, and she realized it was the first time he'd used her given name. Yes. He seemed to struggle with something, then stepped back. Same time next week. Disappointment flashed through her, quickly suppressed. Yes, I'd like that. She watched him disappear back into the trees, leading Buttercup behind his own mount. Only when he was gone did she realize she'd forgotten to be self-conscious about her appearance all day. He'd looked at her the same whether she was struggling gracelessly into the saddle or successfully building her fire with patience, interest, and something else she didn't dare name yet. The walk back to town felt like returning to a too-small cage. As she neared the boarding house, Eleanor saw a cluster of women on the porch, clearly waiting. "There she is," Mrs. Hartley announced. "Out until nearly dark. I wonder what kind of mountain lessons keep a woman out so long." "Educational ones," Eleanor said calmly, climbing the steps. She was too tired and too full of the day's wonders to care about their implications. "Eleanor," Miss Crawford said with false sweetness, "we're just concerned. A woman alone with a man like that—" "A man like what?" Eleanor interrupted, surprising herself with her firmness. "A man who treats me with respect, who teaches useful skills instead of gossip, who sees value in me beyond my ability to pour tea and pretend I don't notice the whispers." The women exchanged glances. Mrs. Hartley drew herself up. "Well, I see he's already having an influence. Such rudeness." "No," Eleanor said, brushing past them. "That's not his influence. That's mine." In her room, she pulled off her boots and divided skirt, wincing at sore muscles that would be worse tomorrow. But as she lit her lamp and opened her notebook to record the day's lessons properly, Eleanor felt more alive than she had in years. She sketched the bear's head rock, the 3 pines growing from one root, the way fire looked reflecting off snow. But between the practical notes, other observations crept in. His hands are gentle with the horses, firm but never harsh. He has a way of teaching that assumes competence rather than inability. When he smiles rarely but genuinely lines crease around his eyes like sun through clouds. A knock at her door interrupted her writing. She opened it to find Mr. Donnelly holding a small package. "This came for you," he said, his eyes twinkling. "Special delivery from Mrs. Chen." Eleanor unwrapped it carefully. Inside was a leather journal, much finer than her cheap notebook, and a note in Mrs. Chen's careful script. "For mountain lessons. Know where you go. My husband's niece learned same way, long ago. Is good." Eleanor clutched the journal, understanding the implicit approval in those few words. Mrs. Chen had given her more than employment, she'd given her an ally. That night, Eleanor transferred her most important observations to the new journal, including her sketches and trail notes. But on the first page, she wrote something else. "Today I learned to build fire from snow, to read direction from moss, to trust a horse with my safety. But more than that, I learned I am capable of learning, that my hands can be strong as well as careful, that someone might teach me not out of pity, but out of belief in my ability. The mountains are harsh but honest. Perhaps that's what I've been seeking all along, a place where pretense falls away like snow from branches, leaving only what is true and enduring. I am finding that place, and finding too that I might be made for it after all." Outside, snow began to fall again, soft and steady. Eleanor thought of next week's lesson, of all the weeks to come, of knowledge building like snowflakes into something substantial. She thought of gray eyes and patient hands, of coffee shared by a fire, of her own name spoken soft as snowfall. She was learning the mountains, but perhaps, she thought as she prepared for bed, she was also learning herself, not the small, apologetic version Cedar Ridge expected, but someone altogether larger and more possible, someone who could build fires and read weather, who could speak her mind and choose her path, someone who might, eventually, be worth a mountain man's careful attention, someone who might teach him, too, that broken things could learn to be whole in new ways. The thought warmed her more than any fire as snow continued to fall, blanketing the world in fresh possibilities. The late February sun had little warmth, but it painted the snow-covered peaks in shades of rose and gold. Eleanor sat on a flat boulder overlooking the valley, sketching the view in her leather journal while Ezra tended to the horses. 6 weeks of lessons had transformed her from a tentative rider to someone who could navigate the lower mountain trails with growing confidence. "Storm coming," Ezra said, joining her on the boulder. He'd been teaching her to read the subtle signs, the way clouds built over certain peaks, how the wind shifted before weather changed. 2 days, maybe 3. Eleanor studied the sky, trying to see what he saw. The clouds over Devil's Thumb. "Good eye, and feel how the air's different heavier, despite the cold." They sat in companionable silence, sharing dried apples and the hard cheese Eleanor had learned kept well on the trail. These moments had become precious to her when the teacher-student formality dropped and they were simply two people finding solace in each other's company. "I need to tell you something," Ezra said suddenly, his voice carefully neutral. Eleanor's heart stammered. "Oh." "Been thinking about going up to the high cabin. Check the trap lines, resupply for spring." He paused, turning his hat in his hands. "Be gone about a week." "I see." Eleanor kept her voice steady, though disappointment crashed through her like a flash flood. Of course, he was a mountain man, not some town dweller bound by weekly appointments. "When?" "Day after tomorrow. Want to beat that storm?" He glanced at her, something uncertain in his expression. Unless... He stood abruptly, pacing to the edge of the overlook. "It's foolishness. Forget I said anything." Eleanor rose too, crossing to stand beside him. 6 weeks ago, she would have let it drop, would have swallowed her curiosity like she'd swallowed so many words over the years. But the mountains had taught her something about honesty. "Ezra, what were you going to say?" He was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then was going to ask if you'd come with me. The words hung in the thin mountain air like ice crystals. Eleanor's mind raced the impropriety of it, the gossip it would cause, the sheer physical challenge of the high mountains in winter. That would be... improper, dangerous, foolish. His voice was flat. "I know. Forget I asked." "I wasn't going to say any of those things," Eleanor said softly. "I was going to say it would be educational." He turned to look at her then, surprise flickering across his weathered features. "You'd consider it... I've learned to build fires and read tracks and navigate by landmarks. But those are all fair-weather skills. Aren't they? Real mountain knowledge means understanding winter at its worst." Eleanor. Her name on his lips still sent warmth through her. "The high country in winter isn't like these teaching rides. It's harsh, unforgiving. One mistake." "Then I'd better have a good teacher," she interrupted. "Someone who knows every risk and how to manage it." He studied her face, and Eleanor saw the moment he made his decision. "You'd need proper gear. The clothes you have won't do above the tree line." "Tell me what I need." For the next hour, as they rode back down, Ezra outlined everything required for winter mountain travel. Eleanor mentally calculated her savings from Mrs. Chen's wages, determining what she could afford. When they reached the lightning-struck pine, she was surprised when Ezra didn't immediately leave. "There's something else," he said, dismounting. From his saddlebags, he pulled a carefully wrapped bundle. "Was going to wait, but if you're serious about the high country..." Eleanor unwrapped the bundle with trembling fingers. Inside was a coat not new, but well-maintained, made of thick wool lined with what felt like beaver fur. It was clearly a woman's coat, the shoulders narrower than Ezra's broad frame would require. "It was Margaret's," he said quietly. "Been storing it proper, keeping the moths out. She was about your size. Always ran cold, so I had it made special warm for her." Eleanor held the coat like the precious thing it was. "Ezra, I can't..." "You can." His voice was firm. "It's doing no good in a trunk. Margaret was practical. She'd hate waste." He paused, Then added more softly, "She'd have liked you. I think would have appreciated someone who seeks to learn rather than judge." Eleanor slipped the coat on. It fit as if tailored for her, the fur lining immediately warming her. She stroked the sleeves, thinking of another woman who'd worn this coat, who'd been loved so deeply that 7 years later, her husband still grieved. "Thank you," she whispered. "I'll take good care of it." "I know you will." Ezra mounted his horse, then looked back. "Day after tomorrow, dawn. Be at Turner Creek Bridge. If you change your mind." "I won't." He nodded once and was gone, leaving Eleanor standing in Margaret's coat, feeling the weight of trust it represented. The next day passed in a blur of preparation. Eleanor used her savings to purchase thick wool stockings, a sturdy pair of men's boots that actually fit properly, and additional supplies from McKenna's. Tom said nothing as he rang up her purchases, but his knowing look spoke volumes. Mrs. Chen, when Eleanor explained she'd need a week away, simply nodded. "Mountain spirits call some people. Better to answer than fight. I keep your job safe." The hardest part was the boarding house. Eleanor packed quietly, but Mrs. Hartley had eyes like a hawk. "Going somewhere, Miss Whitfield." "Yes." Eleanor didn't elaborate, continuing to fold clothes into her pack. "For a week, it appears. Might we know where?" Eleanor straightened, meeting the woman's suspicious gaze directly. "I'm furthering my education in mountain survival. It's relevant to my work with Mrs. Chen." "With that mountain man?" It wasn't a question. "Mr. Hawthorne has expertise I need to learn." "Mrs. Hartley's face flushed. "Have you lost all sense of propriety? A week alone with a man in the wilderness. You'll be ruined." "In whose eyes?" Eleanor asked calmly. "I'm 32 years old. Mrs. Hartley, I've been ruined for marriage prospects since I turned 25 and failed to shrink myself to an acceptable size. What exactly am I protecting?" "Your reputation, your good name." "My good name?" Eleanor laughed, surprising herself with the bitterness in it. "You mean the name whispered with pity, poor Eleanor Whitfield, the spinster who works in shops. That good name." She fastened her pack, then turned to face the assembled boarders who'd gathered at the commotion. "I'm going to learn winter mountain skills from the most qualified teacher in the territory. We'll observe all appropriate boundaries, separate sleeping arrangements, constant focus on education. But even if we didn't, even if all your sordid implications were true, at least I'd be choosing my path instead of waiting for others to choose for me." Mr. Donnelly, sitting in his corner chair, raised his coffee cup in what looked suspiciously like a salute. That night, Eleanor barely slept. She double-checked her supplies, wrote detailed notes for Mrs. Chen about the pending laundry orders, and tried not to think about what she was about to do. Not the impropriety of it, she'd made her peace with that, but the physical challenge, the trust she was placing in Ezra, the way her heart accelerated when she thought of 7 days learning from him in the solitude of the high country. She dressed before dawn in her warmest clothes, Margaret's coat a comfortable weight on her shoulders. The town was still sleeping as she made her way to Turner Creek Bridge, her boots crunching on frost-brittle snow. Ezra was already there, checking the packs on a third horse. He looked up as she approached, and something eased in his expression. "Wasn't sure you'd come." "I said I would." "Saying and doing are different things." He handed her Buttercup's reins. "Ready." Eleanor mounted smoothly, weeks of practice showing, and settled into the saddle. "Ready?" They rode out as the first light touched the peaks, heading up trails Eleanor had never seen, toward a world above the tree line where winter ruled absolute and survival depended on skill, preparation, and trust. Behind them, Cedar Ridge began to stir. By noon, the gossip would be burning through town like wildfire. But Eleanor found she didn't care. She was riding toward something real harsh and demanding and honest. Beside her rode a man who'd offered her his dead wife's coat and his living trust, who saw her as capable of meeting the mountains on their own terms. In her saddlebags, wrapped in oilcloth, her journal waited for new lessons. But Eleanor suspected the most important education wouldn't be about trap lines or weather signs. It would be about what two damaged people might build together in the honest space between earth and sky, where pretense fell away like snow from an overburdened branch, leaving only what was strong enough to endure. The sun climbed higher, setting the snow to sparkling. Eleanor breathed the thin, cold air and felt, for the first time in her life, truly alive. Whatever came next, storm or sunshine, gossip or growth, she was riding toward it with open eyes and warm hands, dressed in a dead woman's blessing and a living man's faith. The mountains waited, patient and perilous. Eleanor urged Buttercup forward, ready to meet them. The fifth night in the mountains, the storm Ezra had predicted arrived with a vengeance. Eleanor woke to the sound of wind shrieking around the cabin like a living thing, rattling the sturdy walls Ezra had built years ago. She could barely see him across the room, stoking the fire in the pre-dawn darkness. "It's early," he said without turning. "Storm came faster than expected. We're staying put today." Eleanor sat up in her bedroll near the east wall, the careful distance they'd maintained all week. "How bad?" "Bad enough. Temperature's dropping fast. This kind of storm can last days." She dressed quickly in the cold, grateful for Margaret's coat and the skills Ezra had taught her about layering clothes. Over the past days, she'd learned to check trap lines, identify winter animal signs, and navigate in whiteout conditions. But this storm was different. She could feel its intensity in the way the cabin creaked and groaned. "I'll help with breakfast," she offered, moving to the supplies. They worked in companionable silence, preparing coffee and porridge while the storm raged outside. Eleanor had grown comfortable with their routine, the quiet efficiency of two people sharing space respectfully. But today felt different, charged. Perhaps it was the storm's wildness or the enforced intimacy of being truly trapped together. "Tell me about Lucy," Eleanor said suddenly, surprising herself. They'd skirted around the edges of his loss all week, but never directly addressed it. Ezra's hand stilled on the coffee pot. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, she had Margaret's eyes, blue as summer sky, born early, fought for every breath, but strong. God, she was strong. His voice roughened. 3 months old when the fever took them. Margaret went first. Lucy. She held on 2 more days. Doctor said it was unusual for one so small to fight so hard. Eleanor's throat tightened. "I'm sorry. I shouldn't have—" "No." He turned to face her. "It's been 7 years. Sometimes I think I've kept them too locked away. Like if I don't speak of them, I can pretend it was all a dream, the happiness and the loss both." "Why did you keep the cabin?" Eleanor gestured around the small space. "It must hold such memories." "Built it for them. With these hands, every log and chink. Seemed wrong to abandon it." He poured the coffee, steam rising between them. "First year, I nearly went mad. Second year, I learned the mountains don't care about human grief. They just are. Found peace in that." "And now?" He looked at her across the small table, and Eleanor saw something shift in his expression. "Now I'm learning, maybe there's room for more than just survival." The wind howled louder, and somewhere outside, a tree cracked and fell. Eleanor shivered despite the fire's warmth. "You're doing well," Ezra said. "Better than most would in their first real storm." "I had a good teacher." "No." His voice was firm. "You had the will to learn. That's different." They spent the morning checking the cabin's defenses, securing shutters, and bringing in more wood from the covered pile. Eleanor marveled at Ezra's foresight, everything positioned and prepared for exactly this scenario. By afternoon, the storm had intensified. Snow drove horizontally past the windows, and the temperature plummeted until even the well-chinked walls couldn't keep out the cold entirely. They sat close to the fire, Eleanor working on mending one of Ezra's shirts while he repaired a trap spring. "Can I ask you something?" Ezra said eventually. Eleanor nodded, focused on her stitching. "Why weren't you ever married a woman like you, intelligent, capable, kind? Surely there were opportunities." Eleanor's hands stilled. "There were 2 proposals. Actually, when I was younger and—" She gestured at herself. Smaller, Mr. Garrett before he married his current wife and a traveling merchant named Collins. "What happened?" I looked in their eyes and saw they were settling, choosing me because I was convenient, grateful, unlikely to have better options. Mr. Garrett actually said I'd be suitable for his purposes, like I was a piece of furniture. She resumed sewing, her stitches precise. I decided being alone was better than being someone's last resort. "That took courage." Eleanor laughed softly. "Or foolishness. Ask anyone in Cedar Ridge." "Cedar Ridge is full of fools who wouldn't recognize treasure if it was sitting behind their own store counter." The words hung between them, heavy with meaning. Eleanor's heart hammered. But before she could respond, the cabin door rattled violently. Ezra frowned, setting aside the trap spring. "That's not just wind." He opened the door carefully, and Eleanor gasped. A figure stumbled inside with the swirling snow, a young man, barely out of his teens, ice crusting his inadequate clothes. "Please," he gasped through chattering teeth. "My partner, hurt, down the trail." Ezra was already moving, gathering supplies. "How far?" "Half mile, maybe more. Fell crossing a creek. Legs broke bad." Eleanor helped the boy to the fire, wrapping him in blankets. His lips were blue, his hands like ice. She recognized the early signs of frostbite Ezra had taught her to identify. "I have to go get his partner," Ezra said, loading a pack with medical supplies. "Eleanor, can you—" "I'll take care of him," she said firmly. "Go." Ezra caught her shoulders, his gray eyes intense. "The fire cannot go out, no matter what. And if I'm not back by full dark—" "You will be." He squeezed her shoulders once, then plunged into the storm. Eleanor turned her attention to the boy Tommy. He managed to tell her between shivers. She worked methodically, just as Ezra had taught her. Remove wet clothes, warm the core first. Check extremities for frostbite damage. She heated water for tea heavily sweetened with their precious sugar, coaxing it into him, sip by sip. "You're not his wife?" Tommy asked, as feeling returned painfully to his fingers. "No, just a friend." "Funny kind of friendship, you up here alone with him." Despite his condition, there was judgment in his young voice. Eleanor's hands didn't pause in their ministrations. "The mountains don't care about propriety. Tommy, they care about survival. Today, you're lucky that's true." Time crawled. The storm worsened, and Eleanor found herself straining to hear any sound of Ezra's return over the wind. She kept Tommy conscious with questions, learning he and his partner Jake were would-be prospectors, lured by tales of gold and woefully unprepared for winter's reality. Full dark came. Then an hour passed. Eleanor's fear grew with each minute, but she kept her face calm for Tommy's sake. She'd just decided to prepare for a rescue attempt of her own when the door burst open. Ezra staggered in, half carrying, half dragging another young man. Both were covered in snow and ice. Blood stained Jake's left leg, and his face was gray with pain and cold. Eleanor sprang into action. Together, she and Ezra got Jake onto the table. The leg was badly broken, bone visible through torn skin. Eleanor's stomach turned, but she pushed down the nausea. This was no time for weakness. "Hold him," Ezra commanded, pulling out his knife to cut away the ruined pants. "This is going to hurt." What followed was the longest hour of Eleanor's life. She held Jake steady while Ezra set the bone, both of them working to ignore the boy's screams. Eleanor found herself talking constantly nonsense about town gossip, recipes, anything to give Jake something to focus on besides pain. When it was over, the leg was splinted and wrapped, and Jake had mercifully passed out. "You did well," Ezra said quietly as they moved Jake to a bedroll near his partner. "Not many could have stayed steady through that." Eleanor realized she was shaking now that the crisis had passed. "He's so young. They both are. And lucky we were here." Ezra guided her to sit by the fire, pressing a cup of coffee laced with whiskey into her hands. "Drink. You've earned it." They sat together, shoulders touching, while the storm raged and the two boys slept. Eleanor felt the warmth of Ezra's presence, solid and reassuring after the fear of his absence. "I was terrified," she admitted, "when you didn't come back at dark." "I always come back," he said, then, softer, though having someone to come back to, that's new. Eleanor turned to look at him. His face was weathered with exhaustion and cold, but his eyes were warm as they met hers. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he reached out and tucked a strand of hair behind her ear. "Eleanor," he said, her name a question and answer all at once. "Yes," she whispered, not sure what she was agreeing to, but certain it was right. He leaned closer, and Eleanor felt her eyes flutter shut, but just before their lips met, Jake moaned in his sleep, breaking the moment. They pulled apart, breathing unsteadily. "We should rest," Ezra said roughly. "Tomorrow will be hard, getting them down the mountain once the storm breaks." Eleanor nodded, not trusting her voice. They prepared for sleep in their separate spaces, but everything had changed. The careful distance they'd maintained all week had collapsed like snow from an overburdened branch. As she lay in her bedroll, listening to the storm and the breathing of 3 other people, Eleanor thought about Providence. If the boys hadn't gotten lost, if the storm hadn't trapped them, if Jake hadn't broken his leg in just that spot. So many ifs that had led to this moment of almost. In her journal, writing by firelight, she recorded the medical procedures for treating hypothermia and setting bones, but in the margins, she wrote smaller truths. He came back, through the worst storm. He came back, and I, who have spent a lifetime making myself smaller, I was strong when strength was needed. Perhaps that is what these mountains teach, not just survival, but transformation. Not just endurance, but the courage to reach for warmth when it's offered. Outside, the storm began to exhaust itself. Tomorrow would bring the challenge of getting 2 injured boys down the mountain. The day after, Eleanor would return to Cedar Ridge and face whatever gossip her week away had generated. But tonight, in a cabin above the tree line, she had held steady through crisis and felt the almost kiss of a man who saw her as treasure. Not settling. She had been tested by the mountain's harsh honesty and found herself not wanting but capable. The fire crackled, the wind howled, and Eleanor Whitfield, spinster, shop girl, woman who didn't fit, smiled into the darkness. She was becoming someone else, someone larger, someone who might just be brave enough to reach for what she wanted when the next moment came. And it would come. As surely as spring followed winter, it would come. The morning of their return to Cedar Ridge dawned clear and bright, the storm having blown itself out in the night. Eleanor stood outside the cabin, breathing the sharp mountain air one last time before their descent. The rescued boys were loaded on travois that Ezra had fashioned. Jake still pale but stable. Tommy recovering well from his brush with frostbite. "Ready?" Ezra asked, coming to stand beside her. Eleanor nodded, though her heart was heavy. The week had been a revelation not just of mountain skills, but of herself, of possibilities she'd never dared imagine. Now they would return to the world of propriety and judgment, where what had seemed natural in the mountains would be scrutinized and condemned. The journey down took most of the day, careful and slow with their injured charges. As they neared town, Eleanor could feel herself shrinking, pulling Margaret's coat tighter as if it could shield her from what was coming. They were spotted long before they reached Main Street. People emerged from shops and homes, drawn by the unusual procession. Eleanor heard the whispers starting, saw the shocked faces, the knowing looks. She kept her chin high, focusing on guiding Buttercup safely through the rutted street. "Doctor," Hartwell met them at his office, immediately taking charge of the injured boys. As Jake and Tommy were carried inside, Tommy grabbed Ezra's hand. "Thank you," he said fervently. "Both of you. We'd have died up there." The small crowd that had gathered heard every word. Eleanor saw surprise flicker across several faces. They'd expected scandal, not rescue. Eleanor misses. Chen appeared, her usually calm face creased with concern. "You come, now." Eleanor dismounted, confused by the urgency in her employer's voice. "Mrs." Chen pulled her aside, speaking rapidly in lowered tones. "Letter came, 3 days ago, from Baltimore." Eleanor's blood chilled. She had no connections to Baltimore except, "My sister. She say your mother sick, very sick. Want you come home." Home. Eleanor hadn't thought of Baltimore as home in over a decade. Not since she'd fled west to escape the suffocating expectations of her family. Her mother, who'd spent years lamenting Eleanor's failure to secure a husband, who'd made it clear that Eleanor's size and temperament were deep disappointments. Eleanor looked around, overwhelmed. Ezra was settling accounts with Dr. Hartwell. The townspeople were dispersing, though their curious glances remained. "I need to think." "Mrs." Chen patted her arm. "You take time. Job here when you're ready." Eleanor made her way to the boarding house in a daze. "Mrs." Hartley was waiting, practically vibrating with righteous indignation. 7 nights, she announced to the assembled boarders. "Gone 7 nights with that mountain man, Eleanor Whitfield. Have you no shame?" "We saved 2 lives," Eleanor said wearily. "That's all." "That's all you expect us to believe?" "I expect nothing," Eleanor interrupted. "Believe what you wish. You will anyway." She climbed to her room, ignoring the continued harangue. The letter from her sister lay on her small desk, her mother's condition described in Helen's typically dramatic prose. Reading between the lines, Eleanor could discern real concern beneath the theatrics. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Eleanor, Mr. Donnelly's voice. You have a visitor." She found Ezra waiting on the boarding house porch, hat in hand, looking uncomfortable under Mrs. Hartley's baleful glare. "Walk with me," he asked. They headed toward the edge of town, away from curious eyes. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the muddy street. "Mrs. Chen told me about your mother," Ezra said finally. "You'll go." "I don't know. We haven't spoken in years." She made it clear I was a disappointment. "But she's your mother." Eleanor heard the weight in those words, the loss of his own family coloring his perspective. "Yes." They walked in silence until they reached the cemetery at the town's edge. Ezra led her to a small corner where 2 headstones stood, Margaret Hawthorne and Lucy Hawthorne, the dates heartbreakingly close. "I come here sometimes," he said quietly, "to tell them things, about the mountains, the seasons, about—" He paused, then continued, "about you." Eleanor's breath caught. "Ezra." He turned to face her fully, his gray eyes intense. "I need to say this before you decide about Baltimore. This week, having you in the mountains, seeing how you faced every challenge, it changed something. You changed something." He reached into his coat and pulled out a small wooden box. Inside, on a bed of pine needles, lay a ring not fancy, but beautifully crafted from what looked like silver and turquoise. "Made this years ago," he said. "Practice piece when I was learning metalwork. Never thought I'd have use for it." He took a deep breath. "Eleanor Whitfield, I'm not a man of pretty words or social graces. I can't offer you an easy life or town respectability, but I can offer you partnership, honest work, shared purpose, and all the warmth I have to give. Will you marry me?" Eleanor stared at the ring, her mind spinning. Everything she'd never dared hope for was being offered. But, "Ezra, I might have to go to Baltimore. My family." "Then I'll wait, or I'll come with you, if you'll have me. But I needed you to know, before you face whatever's waiting there, that you have a choice, a place to come back to. Someone who sees you truly and wants nothing more than the chance to build a life together." Eleanor felt tears prick her eyes. "The town will be scandalized. A rushed marriage after a week in the mountains." "Let them talk. We'll be too busy living to listen." She looked at him, this man who'd carved out a life on his own terms, who'd survived loss that would break most people, who looked at her and saw not a spinster or a burden, but a partner worthy of handcrafted rings and patient courtship. "Yes," she said simply. "Yes, I'll marry you." His smile transformed his weathered face. With careful hands, he slipped the ring onto her finger, a perfect fit, as if he'd somehow known all along. "When?" he asked. "Now, today, before I lose my courage or let others' opinions seep back in." An hour later, they stood in Reverend Wallace's parlor. The minister looked deeply uncomfortable but couldn't refuse to perform the ceremony. Mr. Donnelly served as witness, his eyes twinkling with satisfaction. Mrs. Chen stood as Eleanor's attendant, having appeared with a handful of early wildflowers for a bouquet. "Do you, Eleanor, take this man?" Reverend Wallace began. "I do," Eleanor said firmly, not waiting for the full question. She'd waited 32 years. She wouldn't wait another moment. Ezra's vows were simple. "I promise to keep you warm, to share both plenty and want, to see you always as you are on this day, brave and true and mine." When Reverend Wallace pronounced them married, Ezra kissed her with a tenderness that made Eleanor's knees weak. In that moment, she understood that all the cold years, all the shrinking and apologizing, had led to this, to being held by someone who knew mountains and grief and the value of unexpected sweetness. They emerged to find a small crowd gathered, drawn by news that traveled faster than wildfire in a small town. Eleanor saw shock, disapproval, and on a few faces something like envy. "Mrs. Garrett pushed forward. "This is highly irregular, married without banns, without your approval?" Eleanor asked mildly. "Yes, imagine that." Ezra's hand was warm and solid in hers as they walked through the crowd toward the telegraph office. Eleanor had a wire to send to Baltimore. "Married today. Will come if truly needed. Have my own family now. Eleanor Hawthorne." As the clerk sent the message, Eleanor felt the weight of her old life lifting. Tomorrow would bring decisions about Baltimore, about where they would live, about countless practical matters. There would be gossip and judgment, letters from horrified relatives, sermons about propriety and women's proper places. But tonight, she was Eleanor Hawthorne, married to a man who crafted mittens for her cold hands and rings for her warm heart. She would spend her wedding night in a cabin above the tree line, where the air was thin and clear and honest. She would wake to mountain sunrises and the solid presence of a partner who'd waited 7 years to love again. The sun was setting as they rode out of Cedar Ridge, their shadows long across the trail. Eleanor wore Margaret's coat and her new name with equal comfort. Behind them, the town buzzed with scandal. Ahead, the mountains waited, patient and accepting. "No regrets?" Ezra asked as they climbed toward home. Eleanor thought of her notebook, filled now with survival skills and sketches, pressed flowers and new truths. She thought of honeycomb sweetness and rabbit fur warmth, of storms weathered and boys saved, of a ring crafted years ago waiting for this day. "No regrets," she said, urging Buttercup forward. "Only gratitude." The stars were coming out, brilliant in the clear mountain air. Eleanor Hawthorne, no longer too large or too much or not enough, rode toward them with her husband. ready for whatever storms or sunshine lay ahead. She had chosen the narrow path after all, the one that led up and away from everything safe and small. It was, she thought as Ezra began pointing out constellations she was still learning to read, the only path that had ever truly been hers to take. Thank you for listening to this Wild West love story. If you enjoyed Eleanor and Ezra's journey, please comment below and let us know where you're listening from. We'd love to connect with fellow romance readers around the world. Don't forget to subscribe to the From Wild West channel and share your thoughts about this tale of finding love and courage in the Colorado mountains.